We want to tell you about a young woman who arrived at the worst moment of her life with $74, a horse, and a dead man's hammer. That is where this story begins. And we think, if you stay with us, you will agree it is exactly the right place to start. October the 3rd, 1907, a lumber town called Redpine, pressed up against the spruce forests 3 hours north of Sudbury, Ontario. The kind of place that exists entirely because a company decided it should exist. Company-built boarding houses, a company-owned store, a company-run church that held services at times that did not conflict with the Monday morning shift. The Northern Crown Timber Company owned Redpine the way a man owns his boots, completely and without sentiment. Joanna Velde was 22 years old and had lived in the town for 3 years. She had arrived as a girl of 19, with nothing but the address of a man named Hugh Partridge, master blacksmith, whose letter had reached her 2 weeks after her mother died of influenza in a boarding house in Timmins. Her father had been gone since she was 12. She had no siblings, no aunts or uncles she could name. She had a reference letter from a school teacher who described her as industrious and possessed of uncommon mechanical aptitude, and she had the bus fare to Redpine and the stubbornness of someone who has already lost everything once and knows, viscerally, that she can survive it. Hugh Partridge had taken her on without ceremony. He was a wide-shouldered man in his early 60s, with a voice like gravel rolling in a tin bucket, and hands so calloused they looked carved from birchwood. He had trained mill workers in the smithy for 18 years. He had no apprentice. He read her letter, looked at her hands, small but square-palmed, the fingers that would grip a hammer naturally, and told her she could start Monday. For 3 years, she had worked beside him. He taught her to read the color of heated iron, to feel the resistance in a piece of metal before it told you anything else, to understand how the components of the mill's water control system fit together the way a doctor understands a body, not just the parts, but the relationships between them. She learned to fix what other people could only describe as broken. 6 weeks before the letter came, a loading crane at the north end of the mill yard had failed. A shackle pin, insufficiently torqued and never inspected by the new crew of engineers brought in from Toronto. The load came down fast and without warning. Hugh Partridge had been standing directly beneath it. He died before the company doctor arrived from town. The letter came on a Tuesday. Joanna answered the door to find a young man from the company office holding an envelope with both hands, as if it might bite him. His name was Boyd. She had seen him at the company store. He looked like a person who had been asked to do something he did not fully believe was acceptable. "Miss Velde," he said. "This is from Mr. Crawford Holst, the operations manager. It's a formal notice of tenancy termination." She took the envelope. She did not open it at the door. The language inside was careful and lawyerly, but the meaning was blunt enough. The room she occupied in the company boarding house had been allocated to her as part of Hugh Partridge's employment arrangement. With Mr. Partridge's passing, that arrangement had concluded. She was to vacate the premises within 12 days. Enclosed was a bank draft for $45 as a goodwill settlement in recognition of her service to the company. $45. She read the number twice. Then she folded the letter, placed it on Hugh's old workbench beside the cold forge, and stood very still for a moment. She did not weep. The time for weeping had been the night after Hugh died, alone in her room with the lamp turned low. This was something different. This was arithmetic. That evening, Joanna sat at the small table in her room and did what Hugh had taught her to do with any problem. She laid out the facts in order, without wishful thinking. Total money, $45 from the company, $29 from her own savings, $74. She wrote it at the top of the page. She owned a 9-year-old mare named Spruce, steady and sure-footed. She owned Hugh's full set of smithing tools. She had bought them from the company at fair price the week after the accident, using nearly all of her savings. She owned the clothes in her trunk, a winter coat, Hugh's notebooks, and his old cross-peen hammer. The one he had used for 15 years before his shoulder injury forced him to switch to a lighter one. She had kept it not because it was practical. It was heavier than anything she normally worked with, but because it smelled faintly of coal smoke and linseed oil, and she was not ready to let that go. On the other side of the page she wrote, liabilities. Age, 22. A woman in a trade that did not easily hire women, especially in towns that did not know her work. No family. No connections south of Sudbury. The nearest city large enough to absorb a female blacksmith was 3 hours away, and she could not afford the fare and a first month's lodging simultaneously. She could look for work as a domestic, as a cook, as a seamstress. She was capable of all three. She was also skilled at none of them, in the way that made a person competitive in a city full of desperate women who were better at it. She could try to stay in Redpine, but she had already asked, quietly and without drama, at the only two establishments that might have housed her. Both were full. The company boarding house was, of course, no longer available. She struck through each option as she exhausted it. Toronto, no staying, no charity. She wrote the word and then crossed it through so hard she tore the paper slightly. She had never taken charity in her life. She did not intend to start now. The world had handed her a problem with no conventional solution. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she got up, lit the lamp a little higher, and picked up Hugh Partridge's notebooks from the shelf. She had read pieces of them before. Hugh was not a secretive man, and she had borrowed the technical volumes often enough for reference. But she had not read them from the beginning, not in the months since his death. She had been afraid, she understood now, afraid of hearing his voice in his handwriting and not being able to keep herself together. She started from the most recent and worked backward. Most of it was what she expected. Notes on metal fatigue in the mill's couplings, observations about which suppliers had begun cutting corners on iron quality, his calculations for a new tempering setup he had been planning. Between the technical entries were small observations. The sound a particular bend in Coldwater Creek made in spring when the snowmelt came down fast, the way the light moved through the spruce on the north slope in late afternoon. He wrote the way he spoke. Precise, and occasionally, quietly beautiful. On the third night, working through a notebook from 4 years prior, she turned a page and stopped. The entry was headed, HBC Outpost, Upper Coldwater, Survey Notes. Hugh had spent a summer weekend exploring the upper reach of Coldwater Creek, 8 miles north of Redpine, following a story an old Cree trapper had told him about a pre-Confederation Hudson's Bay Company outpost that had been abandoned in the 1870s. He had found it. He described a cabin of hand-hewn square timber, the logs still solid despite 30 years of neglect. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side, but the west wall and the stone chimney were intact and sound. The floor was packed earth, dry and level. The cabin sat on a raised stone foundation. Unusual for the era, Hugh noted, and the reason it had survived so much better than it should have. The site faced south-southwest across a small natural clearing, sheltered from the north by a dense stand of old-growth white spruce. He had sketched the dimensions, roughly 18 feet by 14, ceiling height good. The chimney drew cleanly when he lit a test fire of dry birch scraps. A small outbuilding, a cold storage room attached to the north wall, its stone construction still entirely intact. He wrote at the bottom of the sketch, "The roof is the only real work. The bones of this place are better than most of what was built here in the last 20 years. A person could make something of it, with time and the right materials." Joanna read the entry twice, then she read it a third time. She looked up at the dark window, at the black November night pressing against the glass, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 weeks. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt fragile, and she could not afford fragile things. It was something harder and more useful than hope. It was a plan. She was at Amos Teal's general store when it opened at 7 the next morning. Amos Teal was a compact, deliberate man in his late 50s who had run the only non-company store in Redpine for 20 years by being scrupulously fair, relentlessly well-stocked, and wise enough never to take sides in anything that was not his direct business. He had liked Hugh Partridge the way decent men tend to like each other, without needing to discuss it. He had brought a meat pie to Joanna's door 3 days after the accident, and left it without knocking. She placed her written list on his counter, without preamble. He read it without expression. Cedar shingles enough to re-roof a small cabin. Roofing nails, 2 weights, a good hand axe, a draw knife, 20 pounds of flour, 15 of oats, 10 of dried beans, 5 of salt pork, a tin of lard, coffee, the large tin, a roll of oilcloth, 2 boxes of wooden matches, a new whetstone. "That's a roofing job," he said. "Yes." He looked at the list again, and then at her face, and he read what was in it the way Hugh had taught her to read iron. Not by the surface, but by what the surface was telling you underneath. He did not ask where she was going. He did not mention the eviction, though it was all over town. "Cedar shingles will run you 22, he said. "Rest of the dry goods and hardware, call it 1950, 65 in total, near enough." He paused. "I'll add a 5-pound bag of cornmeal and a tin of condensed milk, no charge." He disappeared into the back and returned with a canvas bag. Inside it, a full tin of kerosene, a box of sulfur matches, a small tallow candle block, and 2 pairs of heavy wool socks. "Winter socks," he said simply. "For the horse, there's a 50-pound sack of oats by the door. Consider it paid." Joanna looked at him. Her throat tightened in the particular way it does when an unexpected kindness lands in a place that is already raw. "Hugh built my first display counter," Amos said, by way of explanation. 23 years ago. Didn't charge me half what it was worth." He slid her receipt across the counter. "I'll have the shingles bundled by this afternoon." She thanked him and meant it, and walked out into the cold gray morning with $65 transformed into something useful. The old outpost. Local trappers had called it the Beaumont Cabin after a company factor who had managed it in its final years, and Joanna kept the name because Hugh had sat at the end of a rough track that faded entirely after the first 3 miles and became only handwritten directions after that. She reached it on the afternoon of the second day. Spruce picking her way carefully through the deadfall and the frozen mud, she tethered the mare to a spruce trunk and walked the last quarter-mile on foot. The cabin was exactly as Hugh had described it, and also nothing like she had imagined. It was smaller looking than the dimensions suggested, because the collapsed east roof section gave the impression of something broken and defeated. But when she stepped inside and stood in the center of the single room, she understood immediately what he had been trying to say about its bones. The walls were solid. The floor was dry. The chimney, when she held a lit match near the flue opening, drew the flame upward cleanly. The roof was bad on one side and needed to come down and be rebuilt. The door was gone entirely. She would hang oilcloth for now and build a proper door when she had the lumber. The single window opening on the south wall had no glass, but she had oilcloth for that as well. She could work with this. "We want you to understand what the next 27 days actually looked like. Not the version where hardship is made to seem picturesque, but the real version. Hands that cracked open in the cold until the palms bled across the work lines. A shoulder that ached so badly for the first 2 weeks that she could barely lift her right arm above her head by evening. The specific indignity of waking at 5 in the morning in a half-repaired cabin where the temperature had dropped to something you could see your breath in, pulling on clothes stiff with cold, and going back out to do it again. She pulled the damaged roof section down with a pry bar and Hugh's old hammer, which was, she discovered, exactly the right weight for demolition work, even if it had always been too heavy for fine smithing. She cleared the rotten timber and stacked it for firewood. She built new rafters from straight spruce poles, lashing them with rope until she could nail them properly. She laid the cedar shingles in overlapping rows, working from the bottom up the way Hugh had taught her. Not roofing specifically, but the principle. Always work from the ground up. Always let gravity be your ally and not your problem. The door she built from split cedar planks, simple and heavy, hung on hinges she forged herself from iron bar stock she had brought in her pack. It was not elegant. It closed, it sealed, it held against the wind. That was enough. For spruce, she built a lean-to against the north wall of the stone-cold storage room. 3 posts, a sloped pole roof, the heavy canvas wrapped around the windward side. The mare had a good winter coat and she was not a delicate animal. Joanna brought her water twice a day, melted from snow in the cabin's fireplace, and measured out the oats with the same precision she measured her own food. On the 27th day, the first real storm of the season arrived. She had 2 days' warning from the sky, a particular shade of yellow-gray in the northwest, the kind Hugh had once pointed out to her on a walk and told her to never ignore, and she used those days to bring in as much deadfall as she could cut and stack inside. When the storm came, it came seriously. 4 days of driving snow and a wind that pushed the temperature to somewhere her thermometer refused to give a meaningful reading. The drifts built against the cabin walls, to the level of the south window. Inside, the fireplace drew perfectly. The square timber walls, 18 inches thick and mortared with clay, she had mixed herself from creekbed deposits, did not flex or settle. The temperature held at what she estimated was somewhere just above freezing at night, and considerably warmer through the day. She burned through her wood at half the rate she had budgeted for, because the thermal mass of those old walls held heat the way good stone always does, slowly absorbing it when the fire was high, giving it back steadily through the hours that followed. She ate beans with salt pork. She drank strong coffee in the mornings. In the long afternoons, with the storm pressing white against the oilcloth windows, she went back through Hugh's notebooks. The earlier ones, the ones from before she had known him. And she kept reading. She survived the storm without drama. She had been afraid she would not. She had been afraid a great deal during those weeks, in the way a person is afraid when they understand exactly what the stakes are and have no one to perform composure for. The fear had not stopped her from working. She thought Hugh would have considered that the important thing. Word traveled, the way it does in small northern Ontario towns, slowly and with its own logic. Amos Teal heard from his supply driver that there was smoke coming from the upper Coldwater in November, which was unusual. He rode out on snowshoes after the first big storm and found what Joanna had built and stood in the middle of it for a long moment without speaking. Hugh would say, "It's square," he told her finally. That was the highest compliment in Hugh Partridge's vocabulary, and Amos Teal knew it. He had brought her a sack of potatoes and half a wheel of cheddar and news from town. The news was not good. The winter had been hard on Redpine. 2 families near the edge of town had nearly run out of fuel. A Finnish family on the creek road had a daughter sick with a chest cold that would not break because the cabin was never warm enough. Several of the older residents had been struggling to keep their stoves efficient in the cold. Joanna listened. Then she asked Amos to tell anyone who needed to know that she was willing to help. They came, carefully and without fanfare, because people in northern communities tend to be too proud to ask for help easily. She did not make them feel that they had asked. She gave them information as if she were discussing something practical and unremarkable, because it was. She showed the family on the creek road how to seal their doorframe with strips of felt cut from an old coat. The kind of draft that made a chest cold, worse came from below, not across. She drew diagrams in the packed snow of the clearing for 2 young mill workers on how to properly season green wood so it would actually burn rather than smolder. She walked the widow on the north road through the construction of a small rocket stove from salvaged brick and a stovepipe elbow, a design that burned small pieces of branch with a heat efficiency that made the fuel supply last 3 times as long. She gave them knowledge, not charity. She was Hugh Partridge's student, and Hugh had believed, quietly but without apology, that the useful thing was always to teach a person how to solve the problem rather than to solve it for them. By January, the people of Redpine had stopped calling her that girl who went up the Coldwater and started calling her something simpler. They called her Joanna. In the last week of January, the Northern Crown Timber Company's main mill began experiencing serious and escalating problems with its water control system. The sluice gate mechanisms on the primary intake channel, the ones that regulated the flow from Coldwater Creek into the mill's head pond, began to fail intermittently, then constantly. Without reliable control of the water intake, the mill could not maintain consistent power to its saws. Production fell. Then the head pond began to rise, unpredictably, despite the gates being in the closed position, suggesting water was entering from somewhere it was not supposed to. The company's engineers from Toronto were baffled. They had built the new intake system the previous spring, replacing a 30-year-old setup they had declared obsolete. They had done everything correctly, according to their training and their instruments. The water did not appear to share their confidence in this. A hydraulic engineer named Leonard Ashcroft was brought in from the provincial capital. He was a quiet, methodical man in his 40s, the kind of professional whose reputation rested entirely on being right, and who was therefore very careful about the things he said out loud. He spent 4 days examining the intake system, the head pond, the channel bed, and the company's survey maps. He found the maps inadequate. He found the intake design theoretically sound, but practically ignorant of local conditions. He found, specifically, that the company's engineers had not accounted for the sediment behavior of a creek whose flood characteristics had changed significantly over the previous decade, and that there appeared to be a secondary subsurface water source entering the channel from the northwest that their surveys had not detected. He heard, while in Redpine, the story of the young woman living alone in the repaired cabin up the Coldwater. He heard it with the quiet civic pride that northern communities reserve for the local who did something genuinely difficult and made no fuss about it. He heard that she had been Hugh Partridge's apprentice. He knew Hugh Partridge's name. There was a paper in a provincial engineering journal from 1901, written by Hugh, on the water management specifications of early Ontario mill construction. It was a well-regarded paper in a narrow field. Leonard Ashcroft hired Amos Teal's son to guide him up the Coldwater. He found Joanna splitting firewood in the clearing when he arrived. She stopped when she saw him, and waited, her grip easy on the axe handle, her expression giving nothing away. He introduced himself and explained his purpose plainly. She appreciated that. She showed him inside. He walked through the cabin slowly, the way a person walks through something they want to understand rather than merely see. He looked at the door hinges she had forged. Simple, clean, correctly weighted. He looked at the clay mortar between the timber courses. He knocked on the wall with his knuckle in 2 places and listened to what it told him. "This is good work," he said, not as a compliment, as an assessment. She brought out the tea and Hugh's notebooks together. He opened the first volume, the technical one, with the mill notes, and she watched his face change. It was a subtle change, the kind that happens below the surface when a person who works with information recognizes information that matters. He read in silence for a long time. Hugh Partridge had spent 15 years documenting the behavior of Coldwater Creek. Not because anyone had asked him to. Because he was Hugh, and Hugh observed things carefully and wrote them down. Because that was how he understood the world. He had noted, with dates and measurements, the seasonal variation in water levels. He had noted the way the spring melt moved differently in wet years than in dry ones. He had noted, in an entry from 1903, the emergence of what he described as a secondary seepage pattern from the northwest bank of the upper channel. Slow, steady, and likely connected to an underground water table that the original mill surveyors had not mapped because it had not yet been significant when the mill was first built. He had noted, most critically, the sedimentation pattern of the lower intake channel in the years before the old system was replaced. He had written, plainly, if the new intake is placed where the company's plan shows it, the sedimentation issue on the northwest side will continue to force debris into the gate mechanism. This will cause failures within the first hard winter. I have raised this with Holst's office. No response received. Leonard Ashcroft set the notebook down on Joanna's table and looked at her. Your mentor raised this concern, he said, in writing. Yes. With the operations management. Yes. The man who sent you the eviction notice. She said nothing. The fire ticked in the grate. Outside, the spruce stood dark and still against a white sky. Ashcroft looked down at the notebook again, then at the others stacked on the table. These notebooks document the hydrological behavior of Coldwater Creek with a precision and duration of observation that the company does not have and cannot replicate. They contain the specific information needed to correctly redesign the intake placement. He paused, choosing his next words with the exactness of his profession. They also document a prior technical advisory that was ignored, which contributed directly to the current failure and its associated costs. He looked up at her. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Miss Velde? She understood. She had understood from the moment she found that entry 4 months ago. She had not said anything about it to anyone, because she had not needed to yet. I understand, she said. The company will want to speak with you. I'd suggest you speak with a solicitor in Sudbury first. I can give you a name. Crawford Holst's offer came 11 days later, delivered in person by Ashcroft, because no one at the Northern Crown Timber Company's Redpine office was willing to make the trip up the Coldwater themselves. The company would purchase the rights to Hugh Partridge's notebooks. They would engage Joanna as a paid technical consultant for the duration of the intake redesign. They would issue a formal letter of apology for the circumstances of her eviction. They would transfer the deed to her former room in the company boarding house, free and clear. The total payment, $8,500. She listened to all of it without her expression changing. $8,500 was not a number she had any real frame of reference for. It was more money than Hugh Partridge had earned in his last 4 years combined. It was more than the $45 that had been offered to her as the price of her eviction and her grief, and the 3 years she had given to the company that now sat across from her, through its representative, speaking carefully about the terms of a revised arrangement. She was quiet for a moment, then, there is one additional condition, she said. Mr. Crawford Holst, the man who signed my notice, he is to be dismissed from his position. Ashcroft nodded. That has already been determined internally. The matter of the ignored advisory from Mr. Partridge has been documented. She accepted the offer. A solicitor in Sudbury handled the papers. The money went into a bank account in her name. The deed was transferred. Crawford Holst left Redpine before the end of the month and did not come back. The reckoning, when it arrived, was quiet and administrative. There was no scene, no confrontation, no moment of visible triumph. Justice, she found, looks less like a fire and more like an invoice finally settled, cold and accurate and complete. She did not immediately move back into the company boarding house. She used part of the settlement to purchase Amos Teal's store that spring, when Amos decided his back and his years together were advising him toward retirement. He sold it to her at a fair price and stayed on 2 mornings a week through the first summer, because she asked him to. She ran the store the way she had built the cabin and trained at the forge, with close attention to what was actually needed and no patience for anything that wasn't. People came to her for nails and flour and rope, and also, increasingly, for the kind of practical advice that is worth more than most things you can buy. She knew the land, she knew the creek, she knew the winter. But every autumn, before the first hard freeze, she would load spruce and ride the 8 miles up the Coldwater to the Beaumont cabin. She would spend 2 or 3 days there, checking the roof, re-shingling where the freeze-thaw had lifted a course, re-caulking the chimney seams, replenishing the woodpile inside. She never let the woodpile fall below what she had stacked in that first November. The cabin was not a monument. She was not a sentimental woman in the way the word is sometimes used as a small insult. But there are things a person does not give up the right to, once they have earned them the hard way. And one of those things is the knowledge, bone deep and unambiguous, that they can survive without asking anyone's permission. She had not been rescued. She had not waited to be. She had read a dead man's notebooks in a cold room with $74 and a plan, and she had built herself a winter fortress with her own hands and his old hammer, and she was still here. Joanna Velde was still here. We think about her sometimes, when the easy paths close and there seems to be nothing left but the hard ones. And we wonder, do you? When everything familiar is taken from you and all that remains is what you know and what you are willing to do with it, what would you build?